And before we do any presentation at Royal Roads, we always like to acknowledge that Royal Roads University lives, learns, and works on the traditional lands of the Kosepsum and the Kwangan ancestors and families. And learning has been happening here for countless generations. And while we're acknowledging things, I also want to acknowledge a few other things. As we are all very familiar with, we are in a very uncertain time where everything is changing and we don't know what the future holds. So one thing at Royal Roads University, we are about change making, and we're about creating courageous leaders. So that is a big part of this series. What does the future look like? How can we be a part of creating this new future? So we're here to support that. And I also want to acknowledge that many of us are working from home, including all of us on this webinar. So if there is any AV disruption, let us know. We're doing the best we can, but of course, more internet connections create more uncertainty. And just if you're not already familiar with Royal Roads, so we're based on Vancouver Island, just outside of Victoria, which is the capital of British Columbia. And we are not only a public university, we are also a National Historic Site. So we have Hatley Castle, which is one of many buildings that we have on our campus. We also have beautiful gardens next to the castle. We're on 560 acres of old growth forest. We're right off the ocean. We're on a lagoon that actually feeds into the ocean. And we have been delivering online learning for 25 years, something we're very proud of, especially at this time when everything is online. So yes, look us up more if you're curious at royalroads.ca. And we are here to discuss the changing landscape of work. So I am joined with Ross Porter, who's the assistant professor and Bachelor of Commerce program head. So thank you for being here, Ross.
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
And Michael Pardy, who is an associate faculty in the School of Business. So thank you for being here, Michael.
Hello, everybody.
So with that, I'm going to pass it on over to Ross to take over.
Thanks, Alana. And again, thanks everyone for joining us. This is the third webinar in this series entitled Navigating Uncertainty. Our first webinar was on the value of entrepreneurialism, and then last month we did one on design thinking, all currents and themes that find their way throughout the BCom program. And today, I'm really pleased to be joined by one of my faculty colleagues, Michael Pardy, who's had a long-standing relationship with Royal Roads in the BCom program as a faculty member over many years. And Michael teaches our business and society class, as well as some of our applied business challenges within the program, and teaches across the university as well. And this is the genesis of conversations that Michael and I have been having for quite some time, and then has been punctuated by the whole matter of COVID and what that presents in terms of challenges and opportunities. And so I'm delighted to be having a dialogue with Michael today about the changing landscape of work. We'll be navigating not only some of the themes that were already quite present before COVID hit, but we're also going to talk about what it represents for the future of work as well. So again, thanks very much for everybody for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Michael, for joining me on this third webinar in our series of Navigating Uncertainty. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael, and then we're going to engage in dialogue as we go throughout. And as Alana said, if there are questions that pop up for you, feel free to share them in the chat box, and I'll try to address them as we go along. But we're also going to create some space at the end of the webinar, so more open-ended discussion.
Thanks, Ross, and hello, everybody. Before I dive in, I would like to offer up just one caveat, and that is that this will be an exercise in description rather than prediction. I think that the future is complex, and I love this quote from Niels Bohr, and it's just this reminder that anybody who says that they know what's going to happen in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years from now is probably selling you some snake oil. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we're paralyzed, that we have a capacity for looking at trends and thinking about the world and continuing to kind of navigate our way forward. I do a lot of work in experiential education, and I think of this as fox feet work, where we feel slowly down the path as we go forward, and we can learn as we go. And that idea of learning as we go is very much not only how I approach my learning and my teaching, but also, I guess, how I'm going to approach today's presentation. So the big question that I started with is this. You know, if we could look 10 or 15 years into the future, how might we prepare ourselves for the future of work? And of course, any specific answer to this question will depend a bit on where you stand or sit in the world. Obviously, I'm sitting here in Victoria. I work at a university, but I also have a long history in the tourism and adventure tourism industry. And so I'll bring some of those perspectives to bear here. And as a thinking person in this world, I also try to pay attention to what's going on around me. And in the spirit of dialogue, always appreciate any thoughts or comments and additional insights that anybody can bring to this conversation. Not the least of which, for example, Bill Morneau just provided a fiscal update an hour ago.
That's right.
And for those of you that don't know, the deficit forecast stands at about $348 billion, the largest deficit that Canada has ever faced at the federal level as a country. And of course, that raises a whole series of questions, not the least of which is how that's going to affect work. So this is very much an evolving situation. And so if some of this information is a couple of days out of date, I apologize.
I think that's an important point. I mean, each of us are being inundated with speculative pieces from think tanks, from consulting groups, and otherwise all speculating on this question, as well as related ones. And as Michael is saying, there's lots of speculation, and we will be speculating a little bit today, but it's very, very challenging to predict at the best of times, let alone the times we find ourselves in. What I thought was interesting, though, about the deficit or the budget update and the deficit numbers is apparently the debt servicing costs are going to be the same, if not less, than they were a year ago because of interest rates. So there's a shiny, there's a silver lining to that outstanding figure of $350 billion. Quite outstanding.
And I think that's just a reminder of the complexity of this situation and the number of sort of moving pieces, which is one of the reasons why this is just a difficult terrain to navigate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
each of us are informed by our own experiences. As Michael said, not only do we bring kind of the academic lens, but we both have a practitioner lens. Michael has been an owner-operator of business for many, many years and is out there dealing with the front lines of the hospitality, tourism, venture ed space. I've been consulting for 20 years and stay deep in touch with people in the industry. And that's also informing some of the perspectives that we'll be sharing with you today.
And just to impose some structure on this conversation, here is a brief agenda. I'm not going to go through it in detail. I'm sure you can all read it. Suffice to say, we'll kind of look at where we are and where we're going, and look at this through the lens, obviously, not only of employment, but business as well, and through government and society. We'll bring some of those pieces in. And then at the end, we'll talk specifically a little bit about COVID. So I think this is a really great example of a real-time experiment. And it reveals much about the nature of work, not only here in Canada, but around the world. And we'll leave time for some questions at the end. But obviously, as we go through, you're more than welcome to ask your questions in the chat box. And in the spirit of dialogue, we'll respond as we go forward. So I thought I would start by looking at some of the drivers of change. And these are largely in the context of Canada, but obviously these drivers play out around the world. So in no particular order or priority, and this is certainly not a comprehensive list, these are some of the significant drivers of change that are being discussed in the literature. One obvious one is demographic changes in the makeup of Canadian society. One notable feature is that we have an aging population domestically. Practically what that means is that many people are retiring out and are no longer in the workplace. And practically, if we did not have a robust immigration program, we would be actually having a shrinking population in our country. So immigration is one of those significant things that we need to wrestle with, and who and where and how and all those kinds of questions. And that plays up again in the fifth driver, which is politics. And with the rise in populism and protectionism, we see resistance to immigration. in various forms, in various ways. And some of this, of course, is is structural and historical, and relates to historical animosities, but some of it is also more contemporary. If we look at some of the issues coming up between Canada and China, for example. There are any number of social drivers that we could look to. One of the ones that I think has been really highlighted in this era of COVID is the social inequities. The burden, the economic and employment burden of COVID is not being borne by the Canadian population equally. It's very apparent that people who have been racialized, young people, for example, immigrants, bear the brunt of the effects of COVID, not only because their jobs are the most vulnerable, but also because many of them have been deemed to be essential workers. And I think that's a bit of a euphemism in this particular context, because of course, if they're essential, they should be valued. And clearly in this context, many of them are not being valued. This kind of sits on top of longer term trends of a growing divide between the rich and the poor. We know that wealth in the English speaking world is accumulating upward, and we see a bit of a hollowing out of the middle class. Those trends are not uniform. They're certainly exacerbated in countries like the US, a little bit less problematic here in Canada. But in places like the UK, it's also problematic. So this social inequity is being expressed as an injustice, and I think fuels many of the social tensions that we're experiencing and feed into things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that we're seeing in the United States, and can't be overlooked. We see some economic trends. One of the interesting ones that most people don't pay a lot of attention to, but is in fact a retreat from economic globalization. Over the last 20 years or so, we've seen a shrinking of global trade by about 15%, and those trends look like they're going to continue. I know we tend to look at globalization as a marker of the modern economy, but I think many people are realizing that it's not all that it was cracked up to be economically, and there are challenges there. And this is another one of those drivers that feed into some of the politics that we're looking at around the world.
I think very clearly some serious recalculation happening across the globe in terms of attitudes towards globalization, both at the nation-state level as well as the local level.
Yeah. And I think where this has played out in COVID, for example, is the security of global supply chains, specifically in the context of Canada and in the media that we've seen in medical supplies, simple things like masks, and the kerfuffle between the US and Canada over restrictions on exporting masks from the US to Canada and all those kinds of things, and also food supply chains.
That's right.
And raising some serious questions about how much we can rely on our global partners in this particular context.
And how do we manage what we consider essential or critical supplies, and maybe a review of offshoring and looking at reshoring, which is kind of the reverse, bringing things back. Some of that has obviously been politically driven, that we've seen south of the border in terms of some of the rhetoric. But now I think it's deep introspection in light of what COVID has revealed in terms of some of the vulnerabilities for essential supplies.
And of course, if government steps in to ensure the security of some of those supplies, that will have an impact on the nature of work in the country and where those work comes from. I guess I would highlight here too, we are dependent on foreign workers. If we think about the importance of agricultural workers in Canada and places like British Columbia, specifically in Southern Ontario and in Quebec, and how vulnerable those populations are, even though they're not Canadian citizens or permanent residents, there are definitely dependencies there that we need to explore. I've talked a little bit already about some of the political dimensions here, so I really won't belabor that point. Suffice to say that anytime we look at the relationships between business and society, we also have to have a conversation about government, and the nature and character of the governments that we have do play a role. in the nature of employment. We only have to think about Canadian federal government's response to COVID and the deployment of the CERB, and to see how government can, if it wants to, have a significant role to play in employment and or unemployment. Yeah, it's quite telling that the conversation has shifted from helping people to get through COVID and now to how we get people back to work. There's a lot of pressure that the federal government is facing, for example, to pull back on the CERB, or even the Conservatives have proposed actually providing a bonus for workers that choose to go back to work, for example. And where those incentives are placed in front of people and how they motivate people are sort of key questions that governments explore. Other two, I think, big drivers that we clearly can't ignore are the technological and the environmental. We're all very familiar with the technological, I'm sure. Not only is it just changing the kinds of jobs that we have, but it's changing the character of those jobs. More and more of our work is dependent on technology. And if we just think about even jobs that we have thought to be relatively protected from these kinds of changes, accounting, medicine, engineering, law, education, all of these high knowledge jobs are also being affected by technology. It's not just manufacturing that has seen a change and an erosion in employment because of technology. And I think it's also just important to note here that not all of these changes are negative. Many new kinds of jobs are being created, and much of the drudgery of certain kinds of jobs are being taken over by technology, leaving way more room for human-on-human interaction in these places of employment. So, worth paying attention there. And then finally, I think, one of the big elephants in the room, and certainly would have been the biggest elephant in the room prior to COVID, is climate change. The large groups of the brightest minds in the world agree that the climate is changing. You may or may not agree that that is human caused, but at this point that's irrelevant. We are facing disruptions that we can't, I don't think, even begin to imagine how they will affect our economy and the nature of work. Not the least of which, for example, here in British Columbia, we're dependent on resource extraction. We think about the forest industry, mining industry, hydroelectric projects for electricity. Climate change will have an impact on all of those. You only have to look at the impact of the pine beetles and their expansion into the northern forests because of climate change, because of warming climate, to see how that might affect what we have considered to be a relatively stable industry here in BC. So these are things that I pay attention to, and when I think about the future of work, I put all these things in a big pot and kind of pay attention to them to see how they might play out. This might seem alarmist. I take this to be descriptive, not a sort of a pessimistic statement. The world has always changed. There have been disruptions before, so it's more just about paying attention to how these forces are playing out. I would say that we have some sense of how this might affect work, and here are some implications, I think, of those drivers. One of the big ones is a move from long-term and time-based work to temporary and task-based work. That looks different for different kinds of people. At the sort of lower end of employment, we refer to this as the gig economy, but many professionals find themselves working in this space as well. I'll use myself as an example. I've been working in post-secondary education for over 15 years, and I'm a gig worker. I work on contract. I've run a business for 25 years, and all my employees work on contract. And this is kind of standard operating procedure. But this has implications for other things that we're talking about today, not the least of which would be how governments choose to support work, for example. In an era where work was relatively stable and well supported through unions, and you worked 50 weeks a year with 2 weeks of holiday, certain kinds of employment insurance and employment supports work well. If we think about unemployment insurance, as it was then known in Canada, when it was first introduced, covered about 90% of people working in Canada. In our current, in its current form, employment insurance in Canada covers something about 40% of the working population, for example. So clearly the infrastructure that we built to support work is lagging behind the reality of work. And this is why I think we have seen renewed calls for things like a guaranteed basic, guaranteed basic income and those kinds of things.
And that's why you often have to look at statistics in a particular way in terms of unemployment rates. What are they capturing and what are they not capturing? In light of the number of people who are more in contingent work that isn't necessarily captured by statistics that we've become familiar with.
Yeah, I think one interesting sort of way of looking at that is that we are used to getting the unemployment numbers, and so that's the number of people that are officially looking for work in Canada. And those rates have fluctuated, and prior to COVID we were doing relatively well. But there's another way of thinking about that. How many people are eligible to work and choosing to work? And so, for example, from 2008, the last time we faced a serious economic disruption, to now, we're actually employing slightly fewer people who are eligible to work. And the implication is that many people have opted out of the formal economy in some way. And that might often mean, for example, in families, it's often the female partner that decides to stay home and raise a child, for example. And that's very important economic work, but we don't capture the value of that work in any of our mainstream statistics. For example, GDP doesn't count that, even though that allows the other partner, for example, to go into the workforce.
Right.
So some interesting questions here. I do think much is being made also of the impact of technology, and particularly artificial intelligence and automation. And the language is often about sort of catastrophic breaks. Yeah. We've lost X amount of manufacturing jobs in Canada over the last 30 years to AI and automation. And I think there's some element of truth to that. But I think a deeper truth is that our work is being eroded rather than being replaced. And so if we think about, my own work as an educator, for example, 30 years ago, I would not have taught online. It would not have sort of been considered to be sort of possible or feasible. And now I do about 80% of my work through technology. The fundamental nature of my work has changed. And to get a sense of how disruptive that is, one only has to have paid attention to all the media and noise that came out around the shift to online learning in the public school system. That we still need teachers, we still need kids to be educated, but how and where we educate children, for example, is changing. And you can see that there's a lag in how various professions are educating new entrants. I think another area that is really striking to me is in accounting, because that is a practice that is highly vulnerable to artificial intelligence. And so, we're seeing finally some very creative work around how, might still have accountants in an era where we can go online and download some software and actually manage our own business without an accountant, without a real person.
And you even look at how the profession has kind of is sought to reposition how it is seen in the eyes of the public, so that the value can still be identified, even though it's different than what it historically has been.
Yeah. This is an interesting one because there's a bunch of stuff going on around sort of where you live and then where you work with globalization. and with the advent of technology, we've seen a trend toward what in the jargon of the academic world is called deterritorialization. Just sort of the place becomes less relevant, that you can live in two separate places. This is, I think, is very real here in Victoria, for example. I know many people that live here but work in the United States, for example, and work electronically. COVID has, I think, raised some interesting questions about this, and it will be interesting to see if we see a re-territorialization of work, especially when we also consider that we're retreating from globalization, and we are looking potentially to bring closer to us some of our critical supply chains when it comes to things like agriculture and health, peace and security spending, and those kinds of things.
What this does, sorry, go ahead, Michael.
No, go on.
I was going to say what this also, so people have different options available in terms of lifestyle choices, and certainly there's many people in Victoria who live here but whose work is not based here. But also what it does is it presents some interesting opportunities and challenges for the nature of employment in terms of where you seek it. So as you indicated, where you work and earn may not be where you live and spend. And so the talent pool, to use, for lack of a better term, for employers is expanding in many cases. As the last couple of months have demonstrated, remote or hybrid forms of working have demonstrated some value in ways that maybe people hadn't seen before, or the doability factor has risen in the eyes of many employers. And so now they're thinking about, well, I can actually engage people from afar. So what that means is potentially when you're seeking work, you're not just competing with the local faction, you are now competing with a national or international network of talent. And that presents both challenges and opportunities to the individual as well as to the organization.
Yeah. And the drivers may be different on both sides. I mean, as an employee, as a person looking for work, there are opportunities here. Employers are often look to these measures as a way to save money. Yeah. I know a number of local employers are surrendering leases in the downtown core, for example, because they expect upwards of a third of their workforce to only partially return to a physical workplace or work remotely now. And we have sort of proof, if you will. We have an experiment to show that it is possible. But there are consequences here as well. There are things that we lose when we become increasingly isolated, working from our kitchen table or our home office. So some concerns here. I think another big thing that we need to think about here in Canada is our increasing dependence on immigration for maintaining growth and productivity. I mean, this is just a given. If anybody read the op-ed piece from Brian Mulrooney a couple weeks ago, talking about like a doubling or a tripling of immigration into Canada, and I think that makes sense. And in general, Canada has been very receptive to this, but we also know that these can create short and medium-term disruptions in social cohesion and sort of perceptions of safety and those kinds of things. Old histories of racism and those kinds of things get played out in these kinds of conversations. But this is clearly part of the conversation that we need to be having as a country if we want to continue to be viable economically. Right. And what COVID has revealed is that there are certain jobs in Canada that, for whatever sets of reasons, Canadians are reluctant to do. You only have to look at the gender and color of the people who work in long-term care facilities to get a sense of what that looks like. And this is, again, caught up in trends in globalization and that kind of thing. And then finally, I think, climate change and the gaps that are created in the skills that we need as we transition into a more climate positive future are going to result in lost productivity and constrained growth. And so this is going to have a dampening effect on our economy overall. And that, of course, has echoes that play out in employment.
And this builds on a long-standing dynamic in Canada that amongst the OECD countries has one of the lowest productivity improvement rates, partly borne by the lack of investment in research and development. But obviously that's going to be exacerbated, as you said, by the skills gaps that climate change also presents. So there has to be a rethink about what governments and organizations are willing to invest in, and a preparation to invest at the very same time that a narrative is out there that say this is not the time because of look at the deficit. So that's why we started this conversation in part with the debt and deficit, because there will be certainly lots of voices saying this is not the time to be spending, but at the same time, if organizations just like us as individuals do not invest, what future are we building towards?
And I think there's a role, yeah, for all of us to really think about that future and articulate that vision of the future. We've seen some tentative steps by the federal government. For example, one of the first supports that they put in place for the oil and gas industry was to not support unemployed oil and gas workers in their unemployment, but to actually provide funding for addressing the orphan and abandoned well problem, which is primarily in northern BC and in Alberta, but it was a way of helping that industry address some of their challenges and help maybe transition those workers into a greener future. Obviously, there's a period of transition that we need to go through. It's not about going cold turkey on these things, and I'm not opposed to resource extraction. Just to say that we need to be thinking 25 or 30 years into the future. And what I would say is I think the oil and gas industry, it's very clear to me that they are thinking that far ahead. The lack of imagination, I think, is in our political leadership, not in industry. So what does this all mean? I think, practically, and this is an old statistic, this is from pre-COVID, but upwards of the jobs, in quotes, that we have in our economy today will be fundamentally altered or disappear in the next 10 to 15 years. Some folks push that farther out. It doesn't mean that those jobs, that work doesn't disappear, but that those specific jobs do. And I think this is one of the big things that we need to address. I think how we think about jobs as a kind of unit of work that happens inside an organization needs to change. We tend to think of jobs in a very mechanistic way. It's a cog in a machine. We use that language, or it's a part of this sort of bigger system. And jobs then have these things called job descriptions and templates, because you can then remove the person and plug a new part in. A person retires or gets sick, for example, you can just find a person with those skills and put them back in. But that assumes a relatively stable workplace with relatively stable processes and relatively predictable behaviors in the economy. And as we move to this much more volatile world, I think one of the big trends that I'm seeing is a move away from this idea of a job and a job description to more portable and transferable skills.
I've referred to it as a work portfolio.
Yeah,
I mean that's been our reality, you and I, for most of our career, that we haven't had one thing that occupies all of our time. We've had a number of different things and have worn a number of different hats simultaneously, but that is unique or challenging, will be unique or challenging to much of the workforce moving forward. That's not been their working reality, but it's likely increasingly going to be that.
Yeah.
So Julia asked, what's the time frame for this 40% shift? Different parties will have spoken to this differently, and yeah, this is pre-COVID, and arguably that number might look different coming at present and coming out of COVID. Michael said between 10 and 15 years. I've seen as many as seen some figures saying within 5.
Yeah.
Depending on your view of how disruptive, positively or negatively, advances technology will be, as well as response to climate change.
And there are some methodological issues here, like how you define a job and how do you measure what the jobs are that currently exist. I think the bigger takeaway that I have from this is just about a period of high volatility in employment. And so, for me, and as I work with students who are looking to move into the workforce, and as a business owner, it's more about how do I stand in the middle of this turbulence and move forward. It would be easy to become overwhelmed but I also think that there are some very healthy and positive approaches that we can take. And the exciting part for me as a business person is that there are opportunities in this. You know, when we have disruption like this, we move from a terrain with relatively few mountains that everybody tries to climb to a very hilly terrain. There's a great deal of experimentation and prototyping that happens in these periods. And so these are periods of time that are rife with possibility. And so this is the exciting side of it. And I know it's human nature to focus on the negative, but I think it's also important to remember that there are positives. Just talking to a colleague, and I can't remember the exact number, but 30% of the Fortune 500 companies,
Yep.
So you know the wealthiest companies in the world, 30% of them were formed during or just after the 2008 economic collapse.
That's right. And we've already seen certain sectors of the economy doing relatively well under the current circumstances. So people are seeing opportunity. And Michael and I will speak to this in terms of what this means as individuals, in terms of how we show up and how we frame things. So we don't see this as negative, but we have to confront the reality of the situation. But part of it is the mindset to which we apply seeing opportunity where other people see challenges.
I think it's not only employment or like the workforce that is experiencing changes, but we're also seeing pressure on business. And some of the ones that I think are relevant here are that capitalism is becoming more socially conscious. You might argue that that's a kind of an internal response. It might be a response to external pressures. I don't know. But at the very least, you know, companies want to be seen to be behaving in a socially conscious way. Whether or not that's baked into their DNA is a matter of some debate. But I would argue behavior gets you halfway there. Like I don't necessarily care, you know, why, you know, you adopt sort of a more, you know, green supply chain. If I value that, it's enough that you're doing it at least at the beginning.
Right.
And we do know that behavior drives mental attitudes. We do know that language drives mental attitudes. So, you know, this is some success here, I think. I think the focus on profit is no longer sufficient for success. You know, there are any number of research projects that show that you need to have additional value in your business proposition in order to have a long life as a business, and that you need to give some serious question to what that added value is. And that's as true for a business as it is for you as a person, and we'll come back to that point. This connects back to a couple of the earlier themes in these webinars. There is an increasingly focus on design and not just function. And design is not just about sort of the aesthetics of the product, but it's also a way of developing products. So in traditional businesses, products and services are developed internally with a big launch, and often after years of development. Design is a more iterative process. It's more relational. It requires that you engage with your potential users and your other stakeholders early in the design process. And so for me, this is not just, like I said, an aesthetic issue, but more importantly, it's about how you understand your relationships to the world and how close or distant you keep those relationships. And it's I think forcing a rethink in how businesses sort of understand what they do and how they do it. And I think this very closely ties into the final point here, that brands are becoming more important, not just products. So the products and services that you sell are in very real terms now a kind of a souvenir of experience, that companies are looking to connect people through their products, and they become reflective of these sort of wider social trends. There are challenges with this. You know, brands often drive consumerism. There's all kinds of issues with companies like you know, Nike, for example, doesn't actually make anything anymore. They're not a manufacturing company; they're a brand. All of their manufacturing is outsourced onto other companies. And it's funny to think of Nike in those terms, but I think that's a sort of an exemplar of what it means to be a brand. And Nike faced some was an early adopter of this approach, and they faced a lot of headwind early on, especially with how workers in foreign factories were being treated. And Nike had to really step up and do a lot of work around developing its brand and its reputation. And it's been largely successful, I think, in that regard. We can, there's always challenges to these statements, but I think that that's a useful perspective. But the key thing here is that these brands are often built around a long-term ethic of care, and an ethic of care means relations with the people that use your products and services. And this ties in with my point above about the idea of design. And so the nature of business is changing. And if you think about a local business in Victoria responding to COVID, for example, I've talked to a lot of business owners. A lot of them have sleepless nights sitting around their kitchen table trying to figure out what to do. And many of the more successful ones, successful in navigating this, have leaned into this experience, have experimented, have talked to their customers, have sort of moved forward slowly, made mistakes, learned from them, and moved on. And this is reflective of this design approach. This is reflective of not just focusing on profit, but about actually supporting communities. I think this is particularly telling in the hospitality industry. And then finally, this has been a long time trend, but this has just been reinforced. Digital is definitely part of the future. This is not going away.
Absolutely not. And I think the companies that have been resistant to it have been caught out over the last couple of months. Obviously, the ones that are moving forward have some sort of digital presence and ability to serve customers as well as engage with their employees through a digital platform. And those that haven't have struggled to a much greater extent.
Yeah. And I guess if we're thinking of this from the point of view of a person looking for work, digital literacy is just part of that toolkit that you need to develop. And that doesn't necessarily mean social media. I want to be clear here that the digital landscape is much bigger than the social media landscape. This is proficiency with things like websites and search engine optimization, with online branding, point of sale systems. There's a great story out of Waterloo. A couple of engineering students there, I guess about a year and a bit ago, developed this kind of really rudimentary app that was designed to facilitate sales at farmers markets, just as a way for really like micro businesses to facilitate their relationship and sales with customers. And of course, with COVID, the farmers markets were shut down and many of them are just starting to reopen. But this app that was built as a class project has become the standard in farmers markets across the country. They've been hugely successful. So just this reminder that even in the most sort of traditional and face-to-face of environments, digital is now playing a role. And I have a number of friends and professional acquaintances that work in that space. And most of them have said that they're keeping that technology even when COVID goes away, because they've actually seen an ease of friction in their relationship with clients, and in some cases, even an increase in sales. And COVID was sort of the push that they needed, but they also needed a technology that was sort of reasonable and accessible for that kind of marketplace. So just a really interesting little story, but just a reminder of how some of this stuff is going to be durable. So a lot of what we've been talking about is disruption, and again, that word has a kind of a negative connotation. But I think I'm just going to reiterate this point that I don't think we shouldn't worry. I think we do need to pay attention and do some due diligence and risk management in this space. But there are also opportunities. It's not all doom and gloom. And the reality is that no one is entirely clear about where these opportunities are. but we do know something of what they're going to it's going to require of us to be able to take advantage of the opportunities as they emerge. That we need to be present to the world around us, to sort of look at the terrain and decide which hills we're going to climb. We do have to be prepared to take risks, even fail, but also then learn and grow and develop. And it's that process of experimentation, prototyping and development that will allow us to move forward successfully and overcome some of these challenges. And I think COVID has brought so many examples of this into our sort of wider consciousness. So I think we have many more examples. Companies that have, you know, pivoted their product lines or adjusted their business models to address COVID. Whole new businesses that are emerging in the midst of this pandemic are just indicative of the opportunities that we do also have. But it requires a lot of us as individuals. That, you know, I've talked a lot about this, the system that we're operating in, and a lot of the uncertainty in that system. We need somewhere to stand. We need somewhere to be able to sort of look out on the world from, and ultimately that's ourselves. You know, we bring our own attitudes, our own values, our own beliefs, and our own knowledge to the world. And so I think this world that we're in and moving through requires us to have what's called a growth mindset, and this basically means that we learn as we go, and that failure is an opportunity for learning, not a limit for our ability to do things in this world. And we need to think in slightly more abstract ways about our abilities. You know, it's one thing to think about being able to, you know, program in a specific computer language. It's another thing to understand how computer languages work, and how we understand that architecture, so that we can learn new program languages. I think of my brother, for example, who works in information technology at Carleton University on the user end. So he's a tech person at Carleton. He takes courses every 6 months because that's how fast the technology is changing, and that's how he stays relevant. So he's has the same job title, but what he does changes every 6 months because there's new hardware, there's new software, and he's successful because he has a capacity to learn, because he continues to learn, and tries to stay on that wave, riding it. And that may sound exhausting, but he finds it invigorating. He sees value in that work that he does. He understands that he brings value to the organization, and the organization values him because of how he thinks about his job. You could see a situation where someone who was less motivated, less able to sort of respond to those changes, to become very quickly disenfranchised, and to be a drag on the organization. So I think the other exciting, I guess, piece here is that we've seen a renewed attention paid to soft skills. You know, there's been a lot of emphasis placed on being able to do very specific things. You know, do you know how to build this or program this and those kinds of things. But in this future, we see employers telling post-secondary institutions and governments that what they need are people that are good with people, because a lot of the hard work, the process work, is being taken over by artificial intelligence and automation. What's left is the human interaction. I think a classic example here would be radio imagery, right? You think about the X-ray technician at your local hospital. You know, that's a highly technical job. It uses a lot of very specialized equipment. But increasingly, those images are being processed through artificial intelligence. And we know that they are as good or better than humans at detecting various kinds of anomalies for things like cancer, for example. But what the artificial intelligence software can't do is interact with people and think about regimes of treatment and those kinds of things. So that job that was largely sort of in the background of a hospital, for example, is increasingly becoming forward-facing. And those people need to be interacting with nurses and doctors and patients in a different way than even 5 years ago, for example. Sorry, there was a question there. I saw a hand go up.
Building on that, Michael, if we go to the next slide that kind of doubles down on this point, and in any given week, I have multiple conversations with employers of one form or another, executives who are making consequential decisions around their workforces. And the overriding thing I continue to hear is not a lack of technical knowledge and skill amongst their workforce. The issues that are making the difference, that are driving decisions on who to hire and who to let go, who to promote, the roles and responsibilities that people are given, is I would refer to the language I use as attitude and behavioral disposition. So you could call it soft skills, and here's some other words that kind of describe the essence of what it is that we're talking about. But what I hear, and it makes sense if you think about it, people want keen, curious, and committed people. And as employers or others who engage workers of some form or another find themselves, as the unemployment rate increases, with an abundance of riches to choose from, who rises? It's not those who can simply claim, I have what everybody else has in terms of some modicum of skill and knowledge around said role or responsibility or job category. It's how you show up. Again, it's table stakes. It's what gets you in the game is what I think a lot of people have overvalued over time, and that is knowledge and skill that can be developed in many different ways. And what really matters and is either moving people forward or holding them back is how we get in our own way, which is our attitudinal disposition and how that manifests itself in behaviors. And people want value creators, not friction generators in their workplaces, and much more so moving forward. They're going to need people thinking and acting in very different ways than we've had in the past. And I think the willingness to put up with simply being somebody who can identify a problem and point to somebody else to solve it, rather than somebody steps into that white space and says, I will come up with a better way. I think those days are done for many of us. I don't think we're going to be able to hold that as tightly as we have in the past.
Yeah, I guess the exciting thing for me is that what it also means is that, as a person working in the world, I actually have more agency.
Absolutely.
It's not that an employer says, I need an X to fill this part, this work. Now I can actually bring some of my own ideas and my own energy to an employer or to my own business, for example. But it does require me thinking about these kinds of things.
Absolutely.
What do I want, right? What problems do I want to be engaged with? How do I want to be known in the world? What are the things that I have that give me an unfair advantage over other people? And you just never know where those come up. That's what's the most exciting thing. I have a really eclectic educational background, and I never thought that I would find a job that would actually specifically ask for someone with a background in political science and religious studies and outdoor education. Like, those things are in some ways diametrically opposed, but they represent my interests, and I have found gainful and meaningful work because I have that cluster of skills, and I persevered. And so I guess the upside to this is that if we're moving into a world that has less stable work, less location-based work, well, then we have an opportunity to define what those things look like. We have more freedom in some ways than we have ever had before. It's also a scary world. There are dragons out there. This is I love maps, so this is just taken off of a bunch of old maps. In maps of the world in the sort of 15th and 1600s, where they didn't know what was there, they would put this phrase, right? Hic sunt dragones, like here be dragons, as in, beware, be careful, there are dangers here. Well, but people still went there, right? People still found their way across the Atlantic and down the coast of Africa and over to South America and around the world, not always with positive outcomes, but it represented a certain kind of adventuresome spirit, right? A willingness to take risks, despite all of those unknowns. And so, I think it's definitely you know, we definitely have to think a bit more like adventurers, and, you know, be scanning the horizon for opportunities and trying things out. And there are companies, you know, that are sort of actively pursuing this kind of employment. You know, Ross talked in general terms about conversations that he's had with employers. One well-documented example, if you wanted to go and do some research online, is Netflix. Netflix, excuse me, by and large, doesn't hire according to job descriptions. They hire according to alignment with values. And this quote from the Saint-Exupéry is actually on the Netflix website. This is what you read when you go and look for a job at Netflix. They want people that yearn for the vast and endless sea. They can teach them the skills. They don't need to worry about some of those kinds of details. And often people will move, you know, between sort of technical jobs in their time at Netflix. So just, again, if you wanted to go online and have a quick look, you can see what that might look like. And I wanted to offer up one more example. I talked to a few friends of mine about, you know, what a job in 15 years might be that didn't exist today. And so this, I guess, is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I wanted just to say, you know, that maybe there's a job for a nostalgist. And the piece that I wanted to highlight here is that, you know, this job requires an aging population. This job requires a person with a really diverse educational background, including an aesthetic background. And, you know, who knows if this job will exist or not, but I could see this job emerging. If you think at the popularity of television series like Stranger Things, for example, those period pieces, you know, nostalgia is a feature of the world that we live in. So, you know, something to think about here. I'm just conscious of the time. So maybe I'll just run through, we've kind of touched on this quite a bit. So maybe I'll just kind of summarize here really quickly. You know, clearly COVID raises a whole series of other questions, but I think more importantly, what COVID has done is that it has revealed things to us about our economy and the world that we live in that we maybe have not paid attention to or overlooked before. And as much as this is a period of disruption, I also think this is an opportunity to reimagine, and that we all have a role to play in the small worlds and our bigger worlds. So our sort of familial selves, our professional selves, our citizen selves, all have a role to play here to reimagine the world that we want. And we are in a time when governments, when businesses are receptive to new ideas. And there's a great deal of experimentation going on. And so this, I think, is the opportunity that we have. And this just really sort of reinforces this idea that, you know, we need to think about how we want to be known in the world and how we want to show up, and whether that's as an employee inside an organization or whether it's through creating a new business, for example. But ultimately, this is the question: how are we creating value? If you can feel your way forward through this question, you will be gainfully employed because you will find like-minded people, you will find problems that need people like you, and you're going to leave the world a better place. So I'm going to end there and leave a few minutes for questions.
Questions, reflections, thank you. So we've laid down a lot of things, some things that will be familiar to people, some things that might be challenging us in new ways, but happy to hear any comments or questions. I'll just build on this last point, Michael, in terms of figuring out what you're on about. That sounds, you know, it sounds simple, but it's very challenging, and very few people, I think, are clear. But I think that employers, for lack of a better term, moving forward are going to be more demanding or seeking greater clarity from people in terms of their ability to articulate what they're on about and the value that they can bring, and what, you know, what ignites them, what they're hungry for. And it's not enough to say, hey, my CV should speak for itself in terms of the requisite knowledge and skills. Like I'm saying, that's table stakes. People are looking for what's above the waterline there. And that goes back to what drives me. What am I hungry for? What kind of value do I want to create? And how do I see myself contributing to the life of said organization in new and meaningful ways? Because they need problem solvers, they need innovators, they need creators more than ever. I mean, we've seen the gaps that COVID has wrought in terms of what parts of our economy, what parts of organizations are not functioning as well as they could. And the only way to address that is through great talent, great people who come in thinking and behaving differently. And we need to see ourselves, and it can be incredibly empowering, like you said, that we get to exercise our agency, but it requires us to take more ownership for our future rather than looking for somebody else to pave the way for us.
Yeah,
absolutely. And Sylvie says, oh, sorry, I just noticed Sylvie said about, employers need to be thinking about how they are creating value for employees. Absolutely, it goes both ways. Talent can move, and it's demonstrating that it can move before COVID, and it's going to happen after COVID. The ability for great people to find great work, and employers need to be thinking very consciously about the kinds of terms and conditions they create so that people can thrive. It's the question I often have with employers is are they creating the terms and conditions in their workplace that allow people to do their best work? And if not, why not?
It speaks to the importance of relationships, which I talked about earlier, that this is a different way of thinking about what an organization is. Like I said, we've inherited this very mechanistic model from sort of the industrial period of our economy. And as we've moved more towards a knowledge-based economy and a service-based economy, relationships become more important. And you need to think about an organization not as a hierarchy and a rigid formal structure, but as a network of relationships, which is a very different way of thinking about an organization. And why these, what I'm calling soft skills, are increasingly important. Because you need to actually have healthy relationships. You need to have good communication skills. You need to be able to work in groups to solve these kinds of problems. And that requires the entire organization. It's really telling that in the last 20 years, we've seen a move away from hierarchy in organizational structure, for example. Sure. And there are very serious conversations and practical expressions of hierarchical and holarchical organizations, which are just like, hierarchy is layers, right? Top to down. Heterarchy is networked, and holarchy is a more kind of amorphous and relationship-oriented way of organizing. But these are serious conversations and serious ways of organizing work that did not receive a lot of serious attention 15 or 20 years ago, that are being adopted and practiced by small and large companies.
Well, I was looking at a quote just today from a senior business executive reflecting on what COVID has revealed in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of their enterprise and their ability to move fast and respond to the changing landscape, political, social, economic, and the comment is we're not going back. We've demonstrated we could do things that we said we couldn't do before. We're not going back to old ways. So there's been a fundamental shift. Not everything is going to go from 0 to 100. They're going to settle back to something, but I think very few things are going to settle back to what they were before. There was another piece that was just published about that 20% people feel less prepared for the present than they were a month ago. And that lends itself to this idea of being continuously learning and growing and open and adaptable to change, because we really don't know what's around the corner, and what prepared us for yesterday isn't necessarily what's going to prepare us for tomorrow. So we constantly need to be surveying the landscape and saying, what does this mean for me? I know that we're at time. There's just a couple other slides I just wanted to cover, but Michael and I will stick around. For those that you have to leave at the top of the hour, we understand, but we can stick around for a few more minutes. But I'll just kind of run through the rest of the pieces that I just want to cover off before we close the official piece. If this has ignited your interest in formal education, we offer a range of different programs within the School of Business. Obviously, the program I oversee, the Bachelor of Commerce, and our next intake is in August. We also have a Bachelor of Business Administration, and then we have a range of different graduate programs offered by the school, everything from a doctorate to an MBA to our Master Global Management, and then a number of graduate certificates. So if you're interested in exploring what preparing for the future work looks like a la formal education, then you can reach out to one of our enrollment advisors. Tracy Summers is one of those who's one of the co-hosts here at the top of your screen. But with that, I just wanted to thank everybody for showing up and listening. And as I said, Michael and I can stick around for a few more minutes to answer any questions or carry on the dialogue for those that are interested in doing so.
I want to thank both of you. You guys did an amazing job presenting, and I love the interdisciplinary aspect. I know I mentioned in the chat box, but this is a tenet of Royal Road's learning and teaching model is interdisciplinary learning. So it's really about looking at things from various angles, and you guys really demonstrated that today on the webinar, I believe. So thank you for that. I do have a question here from Wendy, and she's asking, what happens to organizations that primarily focus on the financial bottom line and consider their employees as expendable? In other words, the concept of employee thriving and retention is not a priority.
I think you know the answer, Wendy. They might get some short-term gains based on some sort of metric that is important to some party inside of the organization or outside, depending if it's a publicly traded or privately held organizations or public sector or whatnot, depending on what the stakeholder, shareholder concerns are. But you are not setting yourself up for longevity, sustainable, thriving organization, whether that means profit. So rather than saying the search for profit is the goal, it's the service of customer needs and wants and desires, as well as satisfying the needs and interests of employees in the service of servicing customers that will lend itself to generating the profits that you seek. But if you're blinded by the profit and you will blind yourself to the importance of attending to what the critical stakeholder needs are, including what your employees need in order for them to thrive. So if employees aren't thriving, the organization is not thriving, at least in the mid to short and long term. And I think enlightened employers see that. They are wrestling with it, and they're having to confront the limitations of maybe their own form of education and socialization as to what it means to lead well. So I think that's people are confronting that as individuals, they're confronting that as teams, and they're confronting that as organizations. And again, I'm part of having those kind of conversations with a number of different parties as them recognizing the limits of their own ways of thinking and being prior to COVID, but COVID is just accelerating the realization of that.
And I think where we see this in particular is whether or not a company is privately traded, privately held, or publicly traded, because we're seeing an increasing a separation between the financial markets and sort of the lived economy, if you will. And part of what drives that, which I think is a really important point, is the difference between profit and growth. And much of the value that we see in some of the largest companies in the world is based on a market capitalization, which is a kind of optimistic view of what that business can do in the future. Doesn't necessarily represent sort of real profits. I mean, you look at companies like Amazon, one of the wealthiest companies in the world, actually don't make that much money, like actual money in the bank at the end of the year. Their wealth is based on their share value. And we're seeing that tension, I think, manifest itself south of the border in particular. And if you look at the Toronto Stock Exchange and you look at the effects of COVID on the economy that we live in, the economy that we shop in, we look at the value of those stocks, and those fluctuate in much more dramatic ways. Profit is a requirement for a business, but the profit and growth are not the same thing, and how we profit and how we measure growth are two very different things. And there's a very strong emphasis in the public financial markets on growth, not on profitability. And whereas most small and medium-sized businesses, more locally owned businesses, use profit as a measure. And then, that leads to questions about, how much profit is enough? And, is profit the goal? Or does it matter how you play the game? I mean, clearly you need to make money. You need to make enough money to pay your bills and have a little left over to invest in your company. I don't dispute that. But the way we think about what it means to be successful as a business, I think, has been eroded by our attention to financial markets. And I think that's part of the challenge that we face, is that financial markets have really managed to kind of separate themselves, lift themselves up and away from the lived economy, and have truly become globalized. And the power through ownership of those financialized markets are highly concentrated, not through conspiracy, just through the nature of complex systems. But depending on the research that you want to follow, something between 70 and 80% of the wealth in publicly traded companies, are controlled by about 140 companies, and that's a problem because when the system gets sick, it spreads rapidly. And this is what we saw happen in 2008 because of the high degree of interconnectivity in the financial markets. The contagion in sort of one company spread rapidly around the world. And the good news is COVID is not a financial contagion, right? It's an actual biological contamination.
It's also revealed the interconnections, right? It's revealed how quickly things travel and how quickly things can get disrupted because of the level of integration, like we talked about in terms of supply chains. We were initially thinking, oh, this development halfway around the world is not going to impact us here. It very quickly started to impact us here, and it's still unfolding in terms of people understanding the nature of the impact.
I think one of the things that's really striking to me that didn't really get talked about a lot, but the emergence of COVID in a serious way in Canada didn't come through the West Coast, and it did not come through contact with Asia. It came through contact with Iran and the Iranian Canadian community in Toronto. So if you think about sort of globalization and how things move, there is so much attention being paid to this being this virus from that emerges in China and then travels around the world. It didn't come through BC. It made its way into India, into South Asia, made its way into Iran, and then into Toronto, and then across the country. And it's one of the reasons why BC escaped the worst of this. Yep. And that's just a sort of a reminder that these systems are way more complex than we think they are.
Great. I know that we're about 10 minutes past the top of the hour. If there's any final comments or questions before we break, happy to receive those. And in the meantime, any final thoughts or reflections, Michael? What would you say is the main takeaway that you want people taking from our discussion this afternoon?
I guess two things. One is that there's a great deal of opportunity in this disruption, and that we need to really reflect on how we show up in the world and how we present ourselves to take advantage of those opportunities. That doesn't mean that that's easy. I'm not suggesting that that's just a matter of switching something off in your brain, but I think we need to rethink about how we think about work and how we show up at work. And especially if you're feeling vulnerable, what that means is that you have some ability to take control of this, and it's worth exploring what that might look like. And it doesn't necessarily mean going back to school. It just means, leaning in and taking risks.
Yeah. And building on that, I would say my key point is that yes, for lack of a better term, technical knowledge and skill matters. It's what gets you in the door. It's what gets you in the game, but it's not sufficient. It's necessary, but insufficient to really separate you from the crowd. And I would just implore people to be really cognizant of their own attitude and behavioral disposition and how you show up in the workplace. That's going to count for more, the extent to which you're seen as a positive, enthusiastic contributor, than it is, look at how much I know or look at my education. People are less impressed and concerning about that. It's what you do and how you do it that really matters.
And organizations in the economy are human constructs. We have created them, and they have changed and evolved in various ways through time, and they will continue to do that, and we shape them. Ideas matter.
That's right. Great. Well, with that, Alana, I think we're at a wrap. And thanks everyone for showing up this afternoon and bearing with us for the last hour and 15 minutes. Appreciate it.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
All the best.